firstly, just to explain what the Superhumanity project is about. I mean, mainly the only way we organize this the Biennale project is to try not to do the things that we hate. So we make a kind of list of things about exhibitions that we hate, and then try not to do them, but more than that, try to find the antidote. So one of the things we hate are catalogs in which beautiful writers write beautiful essays in which they use the exhibitors as kind of evidence for their argument. So basically, somebody teaching in a university uses the work, and so you get 3 or 4 really good essays, of which maybe only one of those essays really interrogates and reflects upon the work, and the other ones could be just lifted out and dropped into another catalog. So we hate that. So we thought, okay, and also, how can you have 75 or 250 people producing work and only 3 critics, who are usually friends of the curators, make these kind of little professional essays? Understood to be important in terms of the marketing of a Biennale, the marketing of the career of the artist, and so on, but actually expensive stupidity. So we thought, okay, you would, if you were being serious about human and design, you would need a minimum of 50 writers. And they should also be relieved of the burden of being in the catalog and relieved of the burden of explaining the work, but would address exactly the issues raised in the work. So in a way, they would be parallel artists. They would be contributing what they are good at, writing, in the same way as the contributors were doing that. So we were drinking one night with Nicholas Hirsch and Anton Vidokle, 2 dear friends of ours. And Anton is running e-flux, and Nicholas was about to start e-flux architecture as a new kind of platform. And we thought, okay, maybe this is the way we do it. And secondly, another thing we hate about Biennales, there are 200 things on this list, is the idea of a Biennale. 2 years. If you think about it, if you wanted to invent a time frame which guarantees the irrelevance of an exhibition, it's 2 years. The work is not quite old enough to be good and not quite new enough to be good. It's just enough to inoculate you and make you feel like you've seen the near future, and everybody can synchronize around these views. So what we also thought is if we create a new kind of platform for these 50 writers, this platform would not coincide with the time frame of the Biennale. In fact, it would start before the Biennale, continue during the Biennale, be part of the Biennale, but go on for another 1 or 2 years. So this was really the basis of this model. And so the 4 of us then sat down and say, okay, who are we going to invite? And there was one rule, which is every member of the 4 of us, Anton, Nicholas, Beatriz, and I, had veto power. Now actually, and since we all disagree with each other about everything, it's almost impossible to be selected for Superhumanity. I'm not necessarily saying for good reason, just veto. And as a result, 50 writers were selected, and that's very, very exciting. And they would be asked to write 2,000 words, because as you know, this Biennale has an obsession with 2, powers of 2. So 2,000 words on the question of self-design, using an essay of Boris Groys from, I think, the very first issue of the e-flux journal on self-design, which we all disagree with, and therefore we thought, perfect to start a conversation. And so this is the spirit of the project. Then there was the thought, okay, there has to be a wonderful person who will actually edit. And if you know anything about e-flux, they have very, very high quality of editorial and iconographic research. I think a lot of the editorial work that goes on within e-flux puts to shame most university presses and so on, in the same way that maybe Wikipedia puts to shame classical definitions. I'm not trying to elevate you to the level of Wikipedia, but so very high level. So Nick kindly agreed to do that, so we'll share the stage with us today because Nicholas Hirsch unfortunately could not be with us, but we would want to have Nick here as well Anyway, and maybe Beatriz has a few more thoughts about the project.
I think you already say everything, I suppose, but as always. But I suppose the most interesting part is the idea that writers are part of this Biennale. So we are not using writing as usually is done of famous people in the catalog to kind of elevate your work, to canonize your work, but on the contrary, writing is part of the Biennale, and this kind of more fluid way of doing, which starts the conversation before the Biennale. In fact, we were asking all these writers, philosophers, thinkers, anthropologists, I don't know, etc., to participate in this project. They have been starting to write in July, and as of September something, they went already online. And it will continue throughout the process, the month of the Biennale, and will continue afterwards. It's also for us a way to break the limited time of a Biennale and make it into a more extended conversation. At the end of this period, we will collect actually all these writings in a book that will appear next year. So to the addition of the little book that Mark and I wrote on the notes of an archaeology, and the big fat book of the catalog, and the little guide of the exhibition, we will also have this big book of the 2,000 words by 50 plus authors that are part of the e-flux project. So another book.
And just before handing over to Nick, who will be your sort of MC for the evening, we're lucky to have some very interesting partners in this project. So the idea is that this project is not only displayed in real time in the Biennale, like each time a new e-flux comes out, it's translated into Turkish and is posted inside the exhibition as in a kind of agitprop mode. But this project will then move to Seoul in Korea, where we have a strong partnership at the Museum of Modern Contemporary Art there, where a whole new set of writers will be brought in. And there, actually, the rule will be different. The rule will be, in which way were we stupid in our choices of writers? Like, what were the huge gaps, the blind spots? And to actually allow the project to breathe again with a new set of voices. And so we're very, very excited about those partnerships. And welcome to introduce you to Nick, who's doing an extraordinary job. But I don't want to really call it a job. It's more like an art form. And he is your host now, and we will be, let's say, a triple moderating team.
But it's important to understand that e-flux is part of the exhibition, also as a project that is actually three-dimensionally right behind us in the depot. I don't know whether you have been there, so you absolutely should go and see this installation, which looks to me like a Thomas de Man project. But anyway.
Yeah. No, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Beatriz. Yeah, so as mentioned, Superhumanity is the first project by e-flux Architecture, which is a partner, or it's a wing of the e-flux platform. And while our primary medium is digital, it's online. We do have a physical installation in Depot. It's kind of a field or a forest of agitprop kiosks, as Mark described it. And so. To speak a tiny bit about the project itself and how it and the format of the project, you know, it was said that this will compile itself into a book at the end. But one of the things that we are really taking as one of e-flux Architecture's primary modes is to rethink the format and the means of discursive production. So when we see books today, you know, we maybe see a couple essays that come out, you know, with the release of a book, which, you know, might be 50 essays thick, and then you see this thing and it's, you know, how can you possibly consume this? But instead, we're really investigating the temporal logics of release. And instead of thinking of, you know, the book as this kind of triumphant object, to think of it just as the result of a collection of a much longer and quite intense process of a publication of, you know, 50 or 60 essays. So to go with with kind of the 2,000 words format. We release new texts every other day, so every 2 days. And we've released approximately 13 so far. We released Lydia Kallipoliti yesterday, actually, and tomorrow, today is kind of our day off. But it's not really a day off, but we'll be announcing another one tomorrow. So another side of e-flux architecture, before I stop talking about us and actually about why you guys are all here, is a component to this on which, for any of you that are familiar with e-flux, is the announcements. So we're kind of let's say a two-faced monster. We work with editorial content, we commission new work, but we also serve as a media and publication platform for the dissemination of projects, conferences, symposia, competitions, etc. So every day, but every other day, you will find one or the other, or sometimes, if you're lucky, both. But always, you can find the number two. Okay, so about this event, the project is called SUPERHUMANITY. It's departing from the question of are we human by looking at a text by Boris Groys called The Obligation to Self-Design. And in this text, through a let's say a relatively traditional Marxist lens, Groys looks at the evolution of design. He traces a genealogy of design from the design of the soul to the design of the self to the design of life itself. And we took this kind of intermediary process of the self, which has been spoken about quite extensively with the rise of psychoanalysis. So we took this as a moment to investigate through a different medium, through a different format, through the medium of text, this other facet of humanity that is sometimes even attributed to be, the defining feature of it. This notion of the self, this notion of the self-reflective function of one's own being. So these texts, in their own ways, they engage with the concept of the self, of a reflection, and then they also depart from this. And so the last thing, which I think we'll see today, that the engagement with the self allows us, and through the medium of text, it allows us to investigate the ways that our mind thinks. So this is thinking about not just design as objects or spaces or even networks or genes, but of the thought process that goes on within our minds and the ways that we see and the ways that we think. And I'm really looking forward, to be perfectly honest, how all of these contributors have already responded to this, and we'll add to it in discussion. So the plan for the night or evening, we have 10 panelists divided into 3 panels. They are thematically grouped to allow for conversation amongst. The panelists will speak for 5 minutes each, and to be followed by a 20-minute discussion amongst the moderators and the panelists and the audience. Hopefully everyone can get involved. So the first panel is called The Thresholds of the Human, which is looking at the ways that we have defined the human in the past, and the specific features and characteristics that allow us to do that. And it features Eyal Weizman, Spyros Papapetros, Anselm Franke, and Lesley Lokko. The second panel is called Science Between Reality and Fiction, which looks at the way that scientific investigations have, on the one hand, shaped our imagination, but how our imagination has shaped our understanding of science. And then so this is with Lydia Kallipoliti, Felicity Scott, and Pelin. And then the third panel is called Epistemic Supports, which looks at the way that our mind works and the way that our thought processes work. And this is with Francesca Hughes, Keller Easterling, and Laura Kurgan. So with that, I will take a seat and I will hand over to our first presenter, Eyal Weizman.
Began with a commission by one. Thank you.
You can. So actually, the way. Hold on. The way that we're going to do this to the presenters is we're going to, I think, have the presenters come up individually so that everyone can see the presentations, because there will be presentations for most. And then for the discussion, we will all join on stage. Yeah.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.
And thanks for just the opportunity to exhibit here. The project that Forensic Architecture exhibits downstairs has one of the most interesting, innovative, and radical, I think, of human rights judges in Spain, a man called Baltasar Garzón, who has become distinct for applying something that is referred to as universal jurisdiction. Universal jurisdiction is, in fact, law's attempt to annul the sovereignty or to operate in excess and beyond the sovereignty of states. The legal apparatus that enables it is a principle or is a crime that is referred to as crime against humanity. When you can prove that crime against humanity has been undertaken, you can actually try it in third country, not in a place where that crime has taken place. We were approached in a kind of an experimental project that Garzón pursued, and that is an attempt to apply a kind of a crime against humanity or to apply universal jurisdiction to the forest fires that happened in Indonesia in the summer of 2015. Otherwise, if you would not apply universal jurisdiction, the only competent court to, in fact, arbitrate over that issue would be that of Indonesia, who is reluctant to act upon the criminal responsibilities of corporations. The problem was how to turn that greatest environmental crime or damage that really happened in recent years into a crime against humanity. And the idea that together with Garzón we have pursued is in fact to look at a different kind of victim to those forest fires, not the people but the orangutan apes that inhabit those forests that were burned. And if the orangutan ape could be understood or argued legally as a human, we could see that the destruction of its habitat could be argued to be a crime against humanity. So together with an Argentinian group, M7 Red, we've looked very carefully at a trial in Argentina in which an female orangutan called Sandra, in fact received a form of human rights, or legal personhood, or something that was referred to as non-human right, or the rights of non-humans. And that started a kind of investigation that we've undertaken together into the threshold of the human, using the orangutan as a hinge figure, and understood that in fact it is not really about a kind of a generous expansion of humanity to include the orangutan, but a certain readmission, because the orangutan, until really the end of the 18th century, was considered a human. In fact, early colonial accounts of the orangutans consider it to be one of what was referred to as the strange savages of Borneo and Sumatra. And you could see here, really in the pole that it is holding, in the stick that it is holding in the hand, something that is between nature and a tool. There's still some leaves on it, how the orangutan has just exited the forest and entered into economy in which it could be enslaved. Strangely, it was pro-slavery activists that insisted on the humanity of the orangutan in order to create a kind of a hierarchy within the species that would justify slavery. Only in the 19th century, and the story is more complex, but here are some markers, did the orangutan was returned to nature. The border, the threshold of humanity was drawn after what was referred to as the orangutan wars of the 1770s, in which the dissection of the larynx of the orangutan proved what is now we know not to be true, that the orangutan could not communicate, could not speak. Therefore, humanity was fortified along this threshold, together with the ratification of humanity with the two great declarations, the American and the French, of the rights of citizens and the humans. We were very interested, in fact, in a kind of a synthesis. So you see here, we have the same kind of stick, the same thickness, only it is connected to the tree. The orangutan is firmly back in nature. Here, what you see is a beginning of an orangutan nest, something that was very interesting for Jean-Jacques Rousseau when he wrote in one of his footnotes in A Discourse of Inequality he was referring to those nests. In fact, the kind of the threshold condition of the orangutan, it's being between human and animal, was articulated through a discussion on the architecture of the orangutan that Rousseau was thinking was that, in fact, there were roofs. Now, a roof is very interesting, very distinct from a nest, because a roof is luxury rather than necessity. A roof demonstrates a certain gap for Rousseau between the orangutan and nature. A roof is, or that kind of structure, is a beginning of a slippery slope, in Rousseau terms, towards the civilization. So, how to press play on this? No, back. So what you see below is really our attempt to reconstruct that debate and think about that threshold condition through architecture. We actually got hold of 2 orangutans from the zoo in here in Istanbul, and the full process of their construction you can see below. Thank you very much.
Yes, I do. So I'll say next every time. There's going to be a lot of next. So. Can we start? Okay. Next. According to Friedrich Kiesler, design is born from a crocodile. A crocodile with an open mouth cased inside the open square of the architect's chart next to a piece of raw metal. Next. The first offspring of this act, or birth of, or birth by design, is another crocodile, more abstract than the one of nature, as its abstraction is an act of birth of, even following the logic of the genealogical chart, a line of descendants. Just like the smooth or abstract metal slab appears to be an entirely different animal from the mineral rock from which it's extracted, so it's the abstract alligator an entirely different animal from the crocodile of nature. Larger, smoother, and more in/organic, as its metal-like tail and feet emulate the slab, as well as pliers or axes, as do its jaws and teeth, perhaps the only animal parts that remain essentially unchanged in this new design and therefore preceded, the teeth, that is. Next. A preliminary draft explains the process. Here, the natural crocodile, 1, transforms into the abstract one via the act of painting, 2, or drawing, where an abstract tangle of lines is extracted from the texture of the alligator's squally skin and enclosed inside a rectangle. Next. The chaotic bundle of lines then turns into a regular ornament of diagonal lines and circular dots eurythmically arranged within the aforementioned rectangle, which is the first work of design proper. Early 20th century anthropologists would tell us that the most prominent ornaments derive indeed from reptiles and saurians, such as serpents and lizards. The crocodile, in Kiesler's enlarged case, is the big lizard. Animals who move closer to the earth and with an emphasis on their diminishing appendages, proving the connection between ornament and the animal, but also the geological or the mineral as well as the anorganic condition. Next. Quote. Design is abstracted from nature, animals, plants, rocks, as metals are abstracted from nature, or, end quote. Design is then the product of physical and material extraction, a pulling through and pulling off, both separating and attaching design to these natural resources. Next. Returning to the first chart, we see the painted zigzag ornament corresponding to a flat spiral object made of metal wire, and then finally the same flat ornament transforming into a round skirt at the same point or level that the wire spiral transforms into an earring, becoming attached on a human head. The human body is then the final destination of this first act or birth by design, and the trajectory of the natural body of the crocodile to the overnatural body of a human type, the type that is of 19th century cultural anthropology. Next. We move from nature, next, to abstraction, next, to applied art and ornament, next, to over or supernature of the enhanced human body. Oh, no, previous, yes. Not in a vertical or circular hierarchy, but more in a spiral one, in which the culminating point, see, human, is supposed to return to the same area, but also deviate from the animal or mineral origin. Next. The birth of design, writes Kistler, describes the moment when, quote, man discovers his capacity to convert his own body into a dream image through painting or makeup, end quote. For design is a conversion that, while proceeding from the thick surface of painting to the three-dimensionality of physical bodies and artifacts, next, it maintains the ethereality of that dream image attached or projected most prominently on the screen of the human skin. Next. The painted skin is the first medium of this projective design in which man, propelled by his physical inferiority, leaps back into the animal, here a tiger, next, to compensate his lack of self-confidence, as Kistler writes, in his psychologizing language, which means that the animal redesign of the human skin is an act of building or tectonic support. This generative kinship with the animal expands when design expands from bodily self-design, next, to the human design of other things, including building for man, as Kistler writes, because man is a composite animal of building techniques. Next. Unlike the termite or the beaver, who only know one way of building, man composes all building techniques, from the burrowing of rodents to the nesting of birds, to create not simply a composite building, but himself as a species, through building in a multifarious animal technique. Next. Let me conclude then by returning to the earlier draft with the crocodile on top of Kistler's definition of what is abstract design. Next. At the bottom of the same piece of paper, there's another chart in the form of a building or a house whose roof bears the title Ideology of Building, question mark. Apparently, more than an ideology, next, rather a genealogy of design and its abstraction from nature in three stages, where we move from the source of rocks in the Eolithic to the animals of the Neolithic, and finally, we leap or fly, quote, to the birds of the atomic era. Prehistory belongs to the same transhistoric curve with Kistler's post-war era, specifically 1945 or 1946, which is when these design evolutionary charts are most probably scribbled. Next. The ideology of design is a spiral genealogy. Next. From mineral and animal to human, in its projective identification, next, with a tree growing deer and the human design of a flying bird. Thank you.
So I have no slides, thanks for the opportunity to exhibit here and to be here. I have a little installation of fragments of a little montage of some pictures and quotes and thoughts in the Beaumonti brewery. And I just wanted to highlight basically three elements that some are spelled out in the installation, some are not. All three are kind of notes towards future exhibition projects in conversation with the Biennale, also with previous exhibition projects. And the first one is basically, the working title would be Critical Mediumism. The second one would be simply Origin Stories. And the third one would be The Matrix of All Possible Narratives. The first one, Critical Mediumism, is based on the recognition that somehow this inversion that this Biennale is built on, namely that how we are not just shaping the world, but the world shapes us, also kind of produces a particular problem across a threshold of narratability. Meaning that once we are trying to describe how we are being made, this is something I've started to think about also in the context of this exhibition project on animism, right? Which was also one of the aspects was that sort of how do things have designs on us, right? That basically we do not have a language for that. That our entire language is formed in the kind of Holocene paradigm of productionism, of how, or philosophically hylomorphism, or you could kind of bring up other terms to describe that, no? Like how humans shape formless matter, right? And all our language somehow works more or less, with very few exceptions, along that vector of activity, of being agent, of acting upon. Whereas the opposite vector of being acted upon, which implies that we are sort of in a mediumistic position, in a position of that in art historical context one would call associate with pathos rather than poiesis, and in other contexts, let's say anthropological context, with the kind of paradigmatic non-modern figures of mediumistic conditions, trance conditions, possession, being possessed, with a kind of annulment of our very notion of the subject and therefore of the human, right? Meaning, as we are being annulled in this passivity vector, the human also vanishes, and we enter into a kind of territory of non-narratability. And I think as we are exiting the Holocene matrix, realizing somehow, and this is where I'm getting to the origin stories are basically, in the way I'm trying to think of them right now for a future exhibition project, architectures, maybe kind of inverted architecture, but certainly architectures that sort of try to deal with the conditio humana as a kind of condition of ontological groundlessness, to somehow stabilize and anchor this condition, right? In doing that, they're kind of involved in an endless theory of trickery, of creating and masking the way they create their own conditions of narratability. And this is kind of what's interesting about the architecture of origin narratives, as they kind of create a genealogy of society, legitimize certain hierarchies, naturalize certain thresholds, etc. No? So this is also what the installation tries to address in parts, right? So somehow with the 1 minute, okay, so then I have to cut it short, basically, to the third part, the matrix of all possible narratives. Okay. So one of the questions, this is actually a quote from Carlo Ginzburg, the historian, who at the end of his studies of the witchcraft trials in the Inquisition period makes this very bold claim, right? And I'm reading this kind of hermeneutics of myth at the moment because I somehow think that as we are entering into a post-Holocene condition where a new form of knowledge has to tackle the problem of our being media, or being mediumistic, our ability to articulate the passivity vector and turn it into a different kind of form of agency, of sort of at a media nexus of the active and the passive, right? This is a longer discussion, I cannot get into it. So in that context, I'm looking at this kind of hermeneutics of myth tradition. Ginsburg, at the very end of his book, claims that he's dealing here because he's dealing with shamanistic flight and conditions of mediumism that were sort of colonized in the process of the Inquisition in order to create a particular form of human subject, right? That he's dealing not with just a story among other stories, but with the matrix of all possible narratives. So origin stories set up a particular matrix. If one can claim that there's one matrix for all possible narratives, I doubt it, but it's a bold claim that makes us think, right? So the question that I'm particularly tackling in this little installation and in a future exhibition under this title, probably, is somehow to what degree the stories that we are able to tell somehow are bound and tangled with this Holocene condition of the Neolithic revolution, meaning with the kind of binaries that we've inherited from sort of the transition from, you know, hunter-gatherer cultures to sedentary and semi-nomadic cultures, and especially sort of the particular sort of wicked dialectics that this produces, no? Kind of ontological grounding through particular stories, through architecture, opens the abyss of ontological groundlessness even further. And I think that's something that we are seeing pretty much today. So I'm just going to finish with a quick quote. It's in the exhibition as well. In the very first year, there appeared from the Red Sea in an area bordering on Babylonia a frightening monster named Oannes. It had the whole body of a fish, but underneath and attached to the head of the fish there was another head, human, and joined to the tail of the fish feet like those of man, and it had a human voice. Its form has been preserved in sculpture to this day. This monster spent its time with men, never eating anything, but teaching men the skills necessary for writing and for doing mathematics and for all sorts of knowledge, how to build cities, found temples, make laws. It taught men how to determine borders and divide land, and also how to plant seeds and then to harvest their fruits and vegetables. In short, it taught men all those things conducive of a settled and civilized life. Since then, nothing further has been discovered. So this is from Berosso's History of Babylonia, and it's a quote in the beautiful book, The Origins of Monsters by David Wengrow. Thank you very much.
I'll do the next bit. Great. So, first of all, an enormous thank you to Mark, Beatriz, and Nick for the very kind invitation to come to Istanbul and to write for e-flux in the first place. As far as I'm aware, we are the only African contributors to this eminent event and discussion, which brings with it a certain weight as well as a certain pleasure. The title of my contribution to the publication was, or is, In the Skin of a Lion, a Leopard, a Man. But the title of today's short presentation cuts that in half to read simply, In the Skin. Next, please. Why start with skin? The central question put forward by the organizers of the Biennale is, or was, how does the world design me? I would argue that the answers depend entirely on who the you in question is. For the majority of Africans, questions of origin and questions of design are pertinent, poignant, and sometimes painful. Type in the words origins of humankind into Google, and you will return about 1,320,000 results, 95% of which contain the word Africa. And I confess immediately that I deduced that by sample and not by counting. Next. The South African design contribution to the Biennale is entitled Maropeng, Acts 1 and 2, and it's worth saying something about it as a way of locating the text in its wider landscape, so to speak, a real physical landscape that lies some 60 kilometers north of Johannesburg in an area called the Cradle of Humankind. Maropeng is a word in the Setswana language of the area that means returning to the place of origin, and it refers specifically to the interconnected network of underground caves that hold the world's richest early hominin fossil deposits. The caves made international headlines in September 2013 when two recreational cavers stumbled across a narrow chute or opening in the rock face that led to an underground room or a chamber, subsequently called the Dinaledi Chamber, the Chamber of Stars in Setswana. The National Geographic Society and the University of Witwatersrand expedition over the next 6 months revealed the bones of at least 15 persons or individuals, and we can argue over the use of the word person as a scientific paleoanthropological community have been doing for the past 3 years. But the salient point is that the bones appear to have been placed there deliberately. Lee Berger, the paleoanthropologist leading the expedition, and his team put forward the argument that these individuals were capable of ritual behavior, a sign of symbolic thought and intentional repeated practice, or design if you like, which was previously thought to have emerged amongst Homo neanderthalensis and Homo sapiens, our earliest ancestors. Next. Homo naledi was capable of design. But what does that have to do with skin? Both the Greeks and the Romans had a variety of words to describe skin. Kros in Greek is a common name and often expressed the idea of proximity. Enkroi means close to the skin. Homochroma refers to the evenness of color or complexion of the skin. Derma, meaning hide, was used also perhaps like the English word rind. The two major words in Latin for skin were cutis, signifying living skin, and pellis, signifying dead, flayed skin, used for animals and conveying dread or horror. Like Aristotle, the Syrian philosopher Job al-Abrash believed that the skin was an after effect, the result of the actions of drying and hardening, like scum upon boiled substances. But by the 3rd century BC, the taboo in the classical and Christian worlds on cutting or breaking open the surface of the skin had relaxed sufficiently for the first dissections of dead bodies to take place at the medical school in Alexandria. Aristotle's belief that the skin cannot feel contributed greatly to a general understanding of the skin as a thin rather than thick surface, whose importance lay in its breaching to get to the body underneath. The difference between skin as a thick or thin surface is of particular interest here because of the importance that many African cultures place on the body, and particularly the skin, as the primary medium for creativity and artistic talent, and as the primary resource and repository of identity and self-expression. Next. From oral history to body art, the skin is simply another surface, much like any other, into which culture is carved, sculpted, cut, patterned, and tattooed. In this context, skin acquires a depth, becoming literally a thick space, in which memory, history, tradition, and testimony are literally inscribed. In contrast to the Western tradition outlined of seeing skin primarily as the last protective barrier that keeps the outside in, here the inside of the skin, blood, tissue, secretions, are encouraged to act with its surface to produce the rayed keloid scars that swell the skin's surface, giving it profound, almost elastic depth. The genetic tendency amongst Africans to keloid scarring has produced a highly distinctive art form in the practices of scarification and cicatrice. Design, in this sense, is less something done to the external world, the external envelope of the body, clothing, or society, buildings, for example, as it is a part of the body. The intertwined relationship between self, cultural identity, and skin color is both overwhelmingly superficial in the Aristotelian sense of a very thin covering, and profound. If we think about the skin surface as less a screen onto which our fears and fantasies about power, class, and even sexuality are projected, and more as a literal space of depth, mass, and volume, it allows us to think more deeply and creatively about the elements that make up our identities, from history and shared experiences to ritual and mythology. Claude Levi-Strauss described the body as a surface waiting for the imprintation of culture. And the appreciation of skin as a deep and pliable medium is embedded in many African artistic practices, and it holds provocative potential for contemporary design, particularly architecture, which has historically been viewed as the envelope of the body, separate from it, housing it rather than embodying it. This is my last point here. In his notes for a research program, the Italian architect and urbanist Stefano Boeri describes the spatial and territorial uncertainty of New Europe, stating that our now useless vocabulary continues to make the distinction between center and periphery, between public space and private space. Boeri makes a compelling case for the development of new vocabularies, eclectic atlases, if you like, that better correspond to new spatial realities. His lexicon offers an unexpected insight into the way in which the different understandings of space, form, and place, and design might be combined and read. He speaks of inundation, osmosis, transplant, and pulsation, but the corresponding lexicon of African space might draw on similar uncertainties, skins that are thick and thin, branded and carved. We might begin to speak of ruptures and folds, of surfaces that are stretched, of supple and pliant spaces, and not the petrified monuments that underpin so much of Western architectural history and practice. Last slide. Uncertainty, as he writes, transforms into innovation. For me, at least, the present uncertainty in Africa around contemporary forms of identity and self-expression across a whole range of fields, not just design, takes on more different, more meaningful charge. The possibilities are both exciting and endless. Thank you.
So I will thank everyone again for your presentations. I think that there was quite a lot of overlap and a lot of different readings of similar topics. involved within each of these presentations. And so I thought that maybe now, Mark, I realize in your last in the last panel you said you don't want to talk about the exhibition; it's incredibly boring. But I think with maybe a way to understand the commonalities and the differences amongst these participants. I'm wondering, everyone kind of walked into this school and saw a human body being flayed, effectively, and so I'm wondering if, and of course right next to it we see this kind of transparent man standing there. So I'm wondering if we could maybe just kind of see how this practice, which the practice of anatomists emerged 500 years ago or so, but it's still clearly being shown today. I'm wondering how this not just this dissected representation of the body kind of can be factored through each of the contributions here. Give you a way to start.
So, Eyal, the answer is?
Yes or no? I think no.
Just picking up on next line of argument.
Autopsy.
Of course, I'm entirely hooked on everything that everybody said, and so you receive these little pocket this taste. It's like a wine tasting, and you really want to drink the rest of the wine of each person. But it seems to me one thing that struck me was in Anselm's remark, which I think relates to what Nick is saying, the passivity of being medium, like that which is through which some other agency acts. And so just for some almost random reason, Nick, when you mentioned the flaying of the body, I thought, well, that's just kind of the ultimate passive, not able to act, like a kind of a victim, treated as medium, filmed in high def in an exhibition. So not just and literally as a skin, as the first skin, as you point out, the first skin that is experienced. So the first skin of the exhibition, which is not by accident a series of layers, right, is exactly a body in which the skin is being removed. And again, Lesley, this question is ultimately coming to you, as all questions must, like to Africa. The marking of the skin, particularly if your skin is marked, you will not be seized as a slave. So is the marking of the skin is then a successful defense?
Can you hear me? It's an interesting one because the point is more that Europeans thought that slaves who had been marked were disfigured. So it was a European reading of an imperfect body. And so if you had been marked, you would be left. They were looking for whole, healthy bodies. So consequently, sort of 300-400 years later, that cultural association with marks, having some sort of power relation in the whole slavery game, if you like, has stayed, yeah. So it was two basically separate readings of the same event.
So it bounces back to the Anselm's point, because if I use my own skin as medium, and I subject myself, I am simultaneously active and passive. I'm the medium of my own, and what I produce is art, art which could operate as a defense, but also art that identifies what to do with my body when I die, right? In other words, I will be treated correctly, so in a way, marking my skin with the instructions for my appropriate burial. Yeah. So this kind of, there is, as Nick points out, a kind of super tight, almost embarrassingly tight series of linkages, and I guess I want to throw it, in Spyros' direction. I mean, Kiesler, in your account, comes off like unbelievably clearly rational in the sense of a sequential argument about, in Anselm's language, origins.
I was even thinking, why the crocodile? While all the discussion about ornament stuff, it's about serpents and lizards. Why does he choose the thing? I do believe it's the squalliness of the skin, actually, that brings it closer to the metal that he has next to it. So you have the almost anorganic animal, an animal that has problems with its feet, and doesn't know what to do with them, and so it doesn't know how to move, etc. And all its aggression comes precisely from that inability, right next to the metal. So the anorganic with the inorganic. And he confuses it because in German, unorganisch and anorganisch are almost the same. But the other interesting thing is that all design starts with the skin. By Kistler. But the moment that things start to transform is the first moment that we use our first tools. And the very first tool is actually for him not the stone per se, but the bone. And actually not any bone, the jawbone of your enemy. I'm reminded of what we just said. You don't eat your enemy, you use him as a tool, which I don't know if it's more insulting or more praising. You're turning him to your design. Right? And very interestingly enough, you use him, to cut things, to even throw things, and then you turn him into an ornament when you attach to it animal hair and stuff, and so the very implement then it turns into adornment. So there's a very continuity there from surface to the interior. That I think is very, very telling what that process of design does without ever losing the connection, as I said, to the geological. We go back at that rock that we first saw before the crocodile, right? The mineral. Of course, I have to say, and I was very conscious when I was saying all that, the absolutely equally mineral racial stereotypes that you see in this construction, which is obviously, it goes pair and pair with what he's reading. Frobenius, Cultural Anthropology of Africa, James Fraser, all the 19th century cultural anthropology, which is absolutely built in these, in fact, racial divisions.
Right. And these are books that contain orangutans in quite large numbers, right? The orangutan is a kind of superstar of the 19th century literature, no? Or not?
May I come back to my first kind of like the moment where I blanked on a skin question, and then through that go back to through that to the orangutan. So that I think that what increasingly we see with face recognition algorithms is a kind of cat and mouse kind of camouflage, counter camouflage techniques that are going on. For example, the first facial recognition algorithm would effectively flatten the surface of the face and would be confused by as simple as a beauty spot or a change in a makeup change to the eyebrows. And then facial recognition started to peer into the skull itself. The idea that the skin could create that form of illusion, and effectively by looking at the face from several directions would reconstruct the skull as that which you cannot affect, right? The skin you could affect, you can paint, you can grimace, but the skull is there as the kind of the constant identifier. So there's a kind of return, if you think about it in the context of crime, it returns to a certain understanding of phrenology, right? Because you have a relationship between skull and crime. And then another feature puts us again close to phrenology, and that is that the skull as a medium, right, as a media to understand the mind, to understand, in fact, the soul to a certain extent, is understood as a kind of predictive forensic technique. It's your skull is an inclination to perpetrate certain classes of crime before you have perpetrated them, right? This is a skull of a killer. This is a skull of a thief, of a corrupt person, right? It's a preemptive technique. Through the skull, you peer into the future. And I think that this is, again, something that we see with pattern recognition and all sort of predictive forensic devices that kind of change the direction of analysis from the past to the future. So I think that all that is somehow, we can think of that as a relationship between skin and bone, past and future, and prediction. And this is what I, one of the things that I've seen in that. Now, phrenology emerges somehow as one of its origin is a kind of a drawing of the extreme between an orangutan skull and a human skull. And that creates a kind of a matrix. For example, anatomists like Kemper would draw that spectrum and start locating skulls in between along that matrix in a kind of stratified understanding of humanity. The equality to the orangutan would mean an inequality within the human species. So the extending the humanity to the orangutan would create inequality rather than equality. So I think that again, we are all those things are kind of like double-edged swords that we need to kind of understand. What do we ask, and what are the consequences of an extension of or any action upon that sort of threshold, this elastic threshold of humanity?
Go ahead.
I actually wanted to try and bring this to a question to you, Lesley, because I wanted to pick up on this facial recognition, the mechanisms, how it flattens the face, and then by reading the bone, it almost renders the skin invisible, so thin that it doesn't exist, almost, because it tries to read, it tries to almost ignore what is on top of these bones. But you could also imagine with these practices of scarification and cicatrice that you're talking about, that there would be a certain point where the skin can be rendered thick enough so that it becomes red as bone. And so what I couldn't help but think about, and also to tie it to maybe Anselm's becoming medium. If we take the skin as, if we think of facial recognition as a way to evade this, to use the skin as a medium for that, what it takes is pain. It takes an incredible amount of incision and yeah, just pain. So I'm wondering, can this idea of passivity with reference to the skin be thought through in terms of hurt, or how does this function?
It sort of puts me in mind of two things. One was on the plane coming from Johannesburg last night. There was an article about facial expressions, and it was in relation to the Trump-Clinton debate, which took place the night before. And
back to the orangutan.
Back to the orangutan, yeah. The orangutan in the room. And the writer was actually making a really interesting point, which is that certain facial expressions, we perceive people as more trustworthy if their eyebrows are pointed towards the inside, looking more questioning. Broader faces, signify strength, etc. But what they were sort of saying is, look, it's a bit of a chicken and an egg story. Certain faces have been in power for so long that we associate those things with power, and therefore that's how we read them. But I also think that in the African context, the skin is such a subject of both pain, as in physical pain, and in terms of what one does to it, but also as a site of such emotional pain. And I see that a lot of this attempt to write the history into the skin is a way of the skin speaking back. So, in other words, that the skin acquires its own voice, it can speak its own history. So for me, the skin is less a medium and more a milieu, if that makes sense.
I mean, it just reminds me of something that, just kind of tangential to, and maybe Spyros knows the reference because I kind of can't remember who said it right now, but I think in one of the more kind of classical texts, or anthropological texts on tattooing, this statement is made as, sort of inverting this paradigm, like call it Western, of the body as naked truth. A body has to be made, and the tattooing practice being that sort of, basically a kind of increase and amplification of the body's mediumistic capital, if you will. And where did I want to go with this? I forgot, sorry. No, just slipped me.
Just to sort of throw something into the mix. I know that Eyal will know the details, but Darwin used to go to the zoo all the time and look at a particular orangutan for years and years and years, like looking for the symptoms. But actually what I was trying to think of was there's these two amazing images that you show of one creature who has domesticated nature into a tool and leans against it and it's relatively straight, and the other one who can hang from it but cannot extract it. I mean, these are unbelievably ideologically articulate images, and every single line, they're presumably etchings. So every incised line, kind of a tattooing, technique of drawing, every single line drawn with the same particular political, posturing. So one can imagine not only is it an image of the orangutan with its tool or not its tool, but there's another tool, a little stick, with which these images are being scarred in, which is the medium itself. And the thought that was going through my mind is that, of course, this amazing and simple, amazing because simple argument of Darwin, that, of course, naked skin is an aesthetic decision. Yeah. It was designed. And so the very surface that we are discussing was itself produced as an aesthetic choice. He devotes pages and pages to this remarkable phenomenon, such that one could, to simplify, say there's no such thing as a naked human, or to say it slightly more correctly, the naked human is the most human kind of artwork, and then to treat that artwork as the medium. Again, I suppose what I'm trying to say is that it's skin upon skin upon skin upon skin, which if you do that enough times becomes flesh or even bone, but following Spyros' line, also metal. There's not a kind of it's again with Nietzsche not simply a skin of something that's not a skin, but more skin, more skin, more skin. And I think that's why we favor this archaeological approach, which assumes that if everything is a skin, is partly the nature of archaeology is to always face a surface on the assumption that it is but on top of another surface and another surface. I mean, this whole logic. Hello.
I think that in speaking about skin and tattoo, there's another skinal feature that came very close second to being the kind of the defining stratification of people, very second to skin color, and that is hair. Bodily hair. It was only dumped when Europeans discovered people that they consider inferior with less bodily hair than they, and then that was dumped as the kind of proximity to nature, right? And it is it's those forest people. Anselm and I were speaking about it this morning in relation to his exhibition. Those people that are or the wild children that were discovered in the outlying forests of Europe, kind of came, was a kind of a wonder of the 17th and the 18th century. Children who became animals, who later could be taught again to enter humanity, but did in a single lifetime have crossed the threshold of humanity twice, right? One into nature, back into humanity, and in fact have done within a single lifetime double the movement that for Darwin took thousands of generations of evolution, but still that movement, right, that becoming, that evolving into, in and out of, and that movement is very important for Rousseau, that the ability to move across that threshold. And I think that it's also an invitation. It's an invitation of a possibility to cross back into the forest. And what does it mean? There are no forests. It doesn't mean go back to live in that, but an understanding of a form of life that gives value not through individuation, but through a thickness of relation, through ecology, ecological thinking, rather than this sort of autonomous, right-based discourse that we have. And I think that the sort of the bodily hair is a kind of an echo of that possibility.
There's an entire school of 19th century evolutionary biology which is about hair growth patterns in 5 or 6 different types of chimpanzees or orangutans and the relationship to the human. That you can find, you can retrace the origin of the human species precisely if you look at the skin. And that's in addition to the craniological and the histological analysis. So the surface becomes even more important. And I think what's important also here is that both stones and bones are parts of the surface of the earth. And that surface of the earth can only be read once. Once you read it through the archaeological lens, you destroy it, and then you have to move further on. So it's a very precious skin that can never be recovered. In fact, once it's read.
So I think that we need to maybe move on to the next panel, just as kind of we got in something, but that's how these things go. But so thank you all so much, and we will now transition to panel number 2. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so can I please invite Lydia to the stage? Yes. This is yours?
Pointer?
Yes, I do.
Okay, perfect.
To you and a microphone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'll wait.
Okay, so the next panel is getting underway with the brilliant Lydia Kallipoliti.
Thank you, Mark and Beatriz, not only for your invitation, but for your friendship and inspiration over the years. And this text for e-flux was developed as an offspring from our project Guinea Pigs, which was done in collaboration with my amazing partner in the audience, Andreas Theodoridis. And the e-flux project is speaking about slaves, and this is a very contentious and egregious term. We have heard a lot of slavery today. The title of the text is Master Slaves, but I'm going to speak of it completely neutralized of any political meaning or ideology. I'm going to speak of the master slave as a communication protocol and as a computer theory, and the way in which it was developed in different companies that were subcontractors for the US Navy and Air Forces for a series of anthropomorphic machines that were slaves to a master, a centralized device that would control all the other components. So it was a very specific kind of communication protocol a series of subcomponents were controlled by a major centralized intelligence piece. Now, the term, you should know, was banned from in 2003 by the Global Language Monitor and the County of Los Angeles as the most offensive and egregious term used in different computer softwares. And I'm going to start by a hypothesis. I'm going to outline 2 hypotheses in my 5 minutes based on the obsession of 2 seconds, 2 years on the kind of beautiful jumping from 2 to 2 to 2 that was set up by the Biennial. And my first hypothesis is the story of designing, editing, and replicating ourselves is as much a story of love as one of slavery. And I'm going to show you one type of master-slave device. This is one of my favorite pictures because it was developed in General Electric's aircraft nuclear propulsion department under an Air Force contract, and it was used for radioactive, using it to move around hazardous radioactive equipment. But it was published in Life magazine in 1956 as helping a gracious woman put on her coat, and in the description, the slave device was described as the most dexterous and deft slave device that was helping this woman put on her coat. So there was a very polite nature to the slavery that was proposed by General Electric. Now, behind the scenes, the guy that you think is the master and the engineer of this experiment, one of the earliest master-slave devices, is this guy, Ralph Mosher, who, as you can see, is very sweaty, and he has a very, very hard time controlling his slave. He puts a lot of labor and effort in controlling his slave device, and it really makes you, he spends so much effort in controlling the slave through a particular feature that he developed for these machines, which was called force feedback. And the force feedback was basically the idea of a feedback loop, which the master would feel in his own nervous system all the movements, the kind of pain that of the movements of the slave, so that he's not completely torturing the slave, the machine. So it makes you wonder who's the slave and what kind of painful contract this engineer put upon himself to create this series of slave machines, and how he really enslaved very much also himself. This is one of the first master-slave machines, following a series of these experiments at General Electric, but also other subcontractors of the US Navy and so forth. They were called cybernetic anthropomorphous machines, CAMs, under the rubric of master-slave manipulator projects. Here you see a prototyped arm, and there were several of them. I can't go through all of them, obviously, but this is the kind of president of General Electric admiring one of the exoskeletal slave machines, the Hardyman, which was a suit that you would go into and you would do all these things that a man could not do. But most importantly, these machines were envisioned, here you see the kind of whole team that was working into these master-slave machines, and the Hardyman, which was, this was the pediculator of the walking truck. What was very important about these experiments is that they were not autonomous. They were completely run by the master. So the intelligence was in a very, very linear chain of commands. However, the engineer envisioned the union of the master and the slave as a wedding of sorts, and the wedding was consummated by the connection of the nervous system to the feedback loop of the machinery, so that the machine would really learn from the movements of the master and translate into kinesis the kind of desires and the patterns of movements. So moving on to my second hypothesis in my 1 minute left, maybe, is the fact that the master-slave model reflects and even materializes an absurdity of self-love. It is perhaps the truest version we have of human nature and its absence. And these experiments, which sound ridiculous, I would say today, are absolutely manifested in and thrive today in a very vast amount of research going into military and commercial applications of remotely controlled robots. What you see here is Boston Dynamics' Big Dog, the most advanced robot seamlessly roaming through terrains with 4 legs that are articulated like an animal's and compliant elements to absorb shock and recycle energy from one step to the next. And recently, MarkBot, that was a tip from the wonderful Nick Axel, the multifunction agile remote-controlled robot created by Exponent Inc. was used lethally as a bomb disposal machine for the first time by US police to kill a Dallas shooter in July. Considering today's ubiquity of different genres of machines and machine learning from big data and responsive systems, the master-slave devices exhibit little, if no, computational intelligence, that is, intelligence exhibited by machines with a learning capacity. Although referenced as reconnaissance robots, Amazon's flying drones, which is what you see here, and it will make you very dizzy until we finish, they are suspected to invade our skies by 2020, but they're still controlled by a central intelligence device in a linear chain of commands. Each master-slave's machine might be limited in its operational intelligence, but the vastness of their pervasions into the skies, the seas, spinning out of their own, might in fact create what Benjamin Bratton calls a vast accidental megastructure of sorts. So despite the difference from the original master-slave devices, these types of machines form our understanding of the modern human condition, allowing us to witness how we safely reconstruct ourselves, believing in vain that the design is our own. Master-slave designs can partly be seen as the aspirational projection of a world based on potentiality and connectivity that was presumed along with the emergent reality of digital information. They exhibit the impasses of our capitalist society, delusions of efficiency, flexibility, ubiquitous access to information, and totality. The replicate body of the master-slave envisions a world entirely based on mediation, both between individuals and in space. Even though the master-slave model reflects and materializes an absurdity of self-love, it is perhaps the truest version we have of human nature and its absence. Thank you.
And this one?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
I might put you back to work for this. Is that okay? Sure. Yeah? Okay. And actually, you can go to the next one now. Thanks. So I'm going to talk very briefly about how or why, in the context of an otherwise largely technical conference on space colonization, which took place at Princeton University in 1975, an image like next, this could appear. So this post-Vitruvian man accompanied the presentation of German-American aerospace engineer and science fiction writer Jesko von Puttkamer, next please, who had previously worked on NASA's 1969 Apollo landing mission and in turn on Skylab, which was launched in 1973. 2 years later, and faced with the waning of NASA's funding, next, he was called upon to offer a narrative of how NASA might help realize Princeton physics professor Gerard K. O'Neill's hallucinatory visions for Earth-like space colonies by the year 1990. As von Puttkamer recognized, creating what he termed man-made worlds would require advancing technoscientific knowledge, not only of such unprecedented artificial territory, but of equally unprecedented humans to populate it. Next. The problem at hand was not only to enable humans to physically and psychologically survive within extreme environmental conditions, but to what he called operate effectively, basically as productive subjects within a distinctly biopolitical space colonization apparatus, a task-shifting scientific study and measurement of the human to its redesign to optimize functioning. So the question is why? In addition to more conventional aesthetic renderings, scientific diagrams, and data tabulation, some of which I'll show soon, he included this drawing. Next, please. So embodying the constructive, oh, actually, I missed that one. Next, yeah. Further. Oh, thank you. Embodying the constructive tension between the aesthetic and instrumental dimensions of design, von Puttkamer's appropriation of Leonardo da Vinci's famous late 15th century drawing also speaks to a radical destabilization of the anthropocentric and anthropogeographic logics informing traditional Western logics of things like architecture and design. So Leonardo's anthropometric drawing is typically read as privileging man's dual position at the center and as a sort of proportional measure of both the earthly secular in the square and the cosmic and divine in the circle, in these two domains, quite literally connecting the microcosm of the body to the macroscopic scale of the cosmos. Von Puttkammer's rendering eliminated the earthly module and dislodged the spread eagle cosmic figure into the domain of contemporary technoscientific agendas, implicitly dismantling Leonardo's metaphysical ideals. So it's not surprising that von Puttkammer would remove the earthly side of the operation, for space colonies are, by definition, quite literally, extraterrestrial. But what we might call once cosmic man is perhaps even more violently impacted by the gesture of embedding him within a speculative field of space operations next. So as you see, he's grafted somewhat awkwardly to stand on two platforms. On the left, man's utility in space, and on the right, what he called man's systems evolution, the former privileging humans within this technoscientific apparatus and the later machines. So the figure's hands are in turn pulled beyond the circle, not as a measuring device, but to tie him to two further trajectories, what he calls space transportation system development and development of man-tended free-flying payloads. So the bubble diagrams become increasingly tentative as the scientific and technical extensions pull him towards the year 2000 plus. So we can read the return of this archaic figure either as a ghost of humanism, stretched to its limit, sort of crucified, by this new epistemology and the apparatus it sought to create, the space colony, or by contrast as a privileged node within an expanded system of science and technology, a node that might somehow hold together possible futures, deploying them as yet further extensions of man. So the later raises the specter of engineering hubris, as humans like O'Neill sought to replace God's power in creating future worlds. But the former reading brings me back to the less than godlike status of humans within the larger picture. Next. So within space research, the human remained the site of extensive measurement and calculation, the very medium through which to collect data about the physiological, mechanical, psychological, and social systems. It was not ideal measures or proportions that were sought, but data establishing normative standards and degrees and frequencies of deviation from them. Data typically statistically fed into a new set of depictions, including ergonomic figures, symptomatically absent from von Puttkammer's illustrations, but quite literally inscribed in space vehicles. Next. The translation of such applied research from space transit systems to the expansionist agenda of O'Neill's vision of space colonization, with its search for new Lebensraum, a term that comes up in this context, implicitly recast any such instrumentality of human data. So in The Living and Its Milieu, Georges Canguilhem argued for the mutual reciprocity between humans and their environment. Insisting on a persistent indeterminism and multiplicity in this relationship, he sought to counter politically ambivalent claims that a determining influence, and I quote, authorizes man's unlimited action upon himself through the medium of the milieu. It's a fundamental characteristic of the living thing that it makes its own milieu. It builds one for itself. He wrote of a back and forth logic, adding, the milieu on which the organism depends is structured and organized by the organism itself. So moreover, he reminds us that a living being as a center, medium, or milieu does not dissolve into the environment. Next. Living beings are not simply scripted by environmental apparatuses, even complex and highly scientific ones, just as human bodies never fit quite so neatly within humanist systems of geometrical proportions wherein man appears as a lesser world. Grafting man into four trajectories of technoscientific research, von Puttkammer's diagram suggests an even more radical decentering than that produced when the Copernican revolution dislodged Earth and with it man's position from the center of the universe, while simultaneously returning him to that center as a type of irritant or perhaps a specter. Like Canguilhem, I want to suggest this denaturalization did not seek to shore up humanist assumptions of centrality or notions of agency, but to undermine metaphysical foundation and scientific blindness that read the world as given and as lacking potential for decisions, including political ones, and hence for change. Thank you.
Hi. Oh, it can just loop. It's not so much. You can just open and. Yes, yes. Thank you very much. It's difficult to say something in 5 minutes, but when the editors asked me to reply on the superhumanity question and self-design, I didn't know how to deal with the style of writing, and actually I wrote a fiction text. I was dealing with the text by Guattari that he is trying to define some scales, architectural scales, and by coincidence I was working on this text, and when I received the invitation, what I did in the text that is not online yet, is in the editing. It's a text that I'm the superhuman myself, actually post-superhuman, that I resurrect myself, and I'm in the future, and I write a diary about when I wake up from the resurrection. And this is a kind of many references. I mean, this is not my style of writing, but I thought this is the way to write about scale, thinking about scale, and some creating fragments about post-superhumanity, or post-superhuman myself. I was always very influenced by Michel Houellebecq, and I reference the style of the possibility of island when Daniel is cloning himself several times, 24 times, and there is always one original Daniel speaking, writing, and then there's another chapter always that Daniel 1, Daniel 2, Daniel 3 continues until Daniel 4. At each resurrection, he describes his environment, his body, his feeling in the novel. So a little bit like the style, I copied this, and I was trying to focus on some question of. I'm going to read some part because it's better than explaining in 5 minutes. So I'm just reading some parts. Yeah, sorry for my English. My English is really bad. I'm not a native speaker, but let's try. Entry 3148, Mardin. I turned to the other side. My body faced the red, dark sun. The sunstorm almost had covered the glass window. It has been a very long time since I haven't seen another human being. The city is ruined after a long urban warfare. It is not recognizable at all. Ruined. And in time, it has been covered by a large amount of sun from the south. As the long warfare destroyed the buildings, towns, forests, the weather also changed. An electricity infrastructure was bombed, pumping water from the lower part of northern Mesopotamia was not possible anymore. The stream of Tigris River got relatively lower in time and died. Its riverbed must have been filled with corpses and bones. The borderline removed. There is no one except me as a survivor. Entry 3170, Athens. I did build the cave house by architect Antonas. Before I knew I had to retreat. I remember we met in Athens shortly before the city had fallen. He told me, we need to retreat. I didn't agree. But he was referring the Zizek house, the house of doing nothing. He was arguing, referring the text to Violence by Zizek, that we should retreat and put a distance of what is happening in the society. I withdraw from the society as a political act. I have accepted to escape and live in this house, but I was in a doubt how to retreat completely. How is possible that a form of house can convey such a condition of political act? A confined space with question of infrastructure, questions of interdependency of infrastructure, question of withdrawal. No, I told him. Complete withdrawal is not possible. A home, a house, a cave might cause physical distance. Scale matters. However, society is intertwined with infrastructure and is strong physically, but also has endless fluidity. He said, withdrawal is the cell whose multiplication creates today's communities. If this is the preposition of a political thinking, a distance from the social, and if today sociality is defined by the distance, then we will miss the opportunity to think because of architecture, of an architectonic problem. The condition that constructed I'm sorry, I cannot see. I have to change the glass. The condition that is constructed as a house of thought is structurally an observatory that cannot observe the field it is supposed to contemplate from a distance. So non-involvement was still the way for the political engagement. As an architect, he was speaking about different form of political engagement, sociality, and maybe collectiveness. Is socially possible without collectiveness? What is the role of the architect of how we can scale the retreat that is about a position of disengagement of action of the society? Entry 3,250 Göbekli Tepe. I walked to Göbekli Tepe. It took me some days to reach there by foot. People who cloned themselves 1,000 years ago, 9,000 BC, before Christ, they were there and they were aging in this Neolithical settlement. I have no fear to meet them. They believe that animals are their gods and more superior than humans. Therefore, they can carve the animal motifs on huge stones in their temple, which took long years for archaeologists to analyze. But now we are in my future and in the continuation of their past. My 5 minutes is, everybody's listening, but I think 5 minutes is done. Yeah? Okay. I can. I just want to say quickly, I mean, the text is that where I'm living right now in Mardin, southeast of Turkey, that is facing two wars. One is the Syrian war going on, and the other one is the battle between Turkish military and Kurdish movement. And we are surrounded with huge old past Neolithical site settlement. And the way of writing this text, I mean, I'm discussing more also about Guattari's understanding of scale and what scale means in superhumanity time paradigma, but it's also about censoring the text, because I couldn't write clearly for political reasons. So I had to censor it. For censoring, I used the science fiction literal references. Thank you very much. I'll stay.
Thank you. Okay, thank you all. So I wanted to kind of start the discussion from something that was, I think, thrown in our face in Felicity's talk, which is the question of narrative, and how in this time and within this movement that you're talking about, if we can call it a movement, that is, you know, there's such a strong ideological statement to say, you know, we need to go beyond, we need to explore other planets, we need to go through other places. And so I wanted to, and because I think it's about contemporaneous with the subject matter that Lydia is talking about, but yet the way that this is depicted is, within a laboratory setting, almost devoid of narrative, devoid, of just a purely, inquisitive scientific experiment. And so I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about what sorts of narratives were surrounding this, because I think that we can see it through the Markbot and through Big Dog, how this narrative is playing out today. But I'm wondering what was it back then when these science fiction stories were in NASA?
Do you want me to start?
Yeah.
For me, I mean, I can't answer Lydia's part, but there's a rather simple answer, which was, I mentioned very briefly the two NASA projects that von Puttkamer had worked on, the moon landing, and in turn the Skylab. And by 1975, both of these programs had effectively been canceled by NASA. And with them, let's say, waned the heroic narrative of American technical supremacy, and so for O'Neill, O'Neill in articulating what he called a high frontier after Kennedy's next frontier, was in effect trying to continue a narrative of manifest destiny into outer space. And so there was a very clear type of claim that or sort of ideology that he fed into and in effect sort of depicted images of. So not necessarily my narrative, but that's the narrative that the research works to try and understand, how one can possibly imagine this incredibly fantastic imagination having traction is unthinkable without the precision with which it operated on a type of then failing narrative in the United States. I mean, that's my...
But I think there's also kind of this weird opposite scenario where almost, Lydia, your material is starting so much from the mechanical, the mechanics of what it actually takes to even make a machine move, take a single step. And Felicity, the work that you're dealing with is talking about these massive systems, and then afterwards it's getting to the technical nature of what it actually takes to sustain life. So yeah, maybe I can hand it over to Lydia now to get the opposite side.
Thanks, Nick. That's a great observation. Well, I see these stories as absolutely interlinked, and obviously the laboratory, you mentioned it as a vacuum, but it's a vacuum completely infiltrated by all of the kind of colonizing narrative of outer space and of kind of the hubris of territorial expansion beyond the kind of known cosmos of the Earth and our projection to the universe, which is an entire decade or couple of decades. These types of experiments that I was talking about are an offspring from other types of experiments which were nourished by not only a heroic statement of man's territorial expansion, but statistical data and analysis and very careful work on how to reconstitute human physiology. So the major project for colonizing, let's say, a large, vast territory of outer space was the reinvention of the body and the physiology of the environment. And I was very, very much interested in that project as a project of hubris, but also as a project of fundamental devolution of science, like looking into, if you see, you mentioned mechanical narrative, like all of their slaves barely worked. They didn't stand right. They were almost like falling down. And a lot of the NASA projects that had all of these great aspirational colonization diagrams, none of them worked. So there was failure all around. But the interesting part is not how they failed or to register a story of obsolescence, but perhaps to see what is it that really drove the fields of design experimentation into this fundamental devolution of looking what are the primordial instincts of men, of how we can reconstitute the environment, and how this kind of development infiltrated all sorts of fields of design, including engineering and design and so forth. So it was really interesting, like the big dogs also fall down. They don't stand erect. And when I saw the orangutan, maybe I'm mispronouncing this creature at the previous panel, I was very interested in the fact that that somehow erection is the ultimate symbol of let's say progress or positivism, and all of these kind of machines were kind of in a state of disassembly or falling apart, and I found that kind of interesting.
I was thinking that a little bit listening to the three of you picks up again this question of the animal, seems to me, because a typical understanding of these augmented men that you show is kind of a standard kind of man becomes machine logic, but it is interesting to me that the endpoint is a dog, right? So actually, it could be more interesting to consider that what's really going on is an attempt to become an animal, and that really these are aspirations towards a kind of animality, because the standard assumption is that the human body, psyche, etc., is let's say pre-technological, and therefore this addition of this equipment is a kind of move is a sort of a technological takeover or expansion of, as it were, a human capacity. But at the point at which if you take the thesis, which is relatively straightforward, that nothing is more human than technology, or technology is that which makes the human human, then what's going on, and it a little bit picks up on Anselm's origin, like what would be the origin of the human? The human would be not something that uses technology, but something that would be a kind of effect of technology. And you see it, of course, in this amazing prosthetically expanded Leonardo figure, now reaches into outer space and through time, who radiates to 2000 plus. But I think it's also there in Pelin's talk, because with Göbekli Tepe, you have this astonishing situation where when one can discuss an architecture before technology. That is to say, these are constructions before settlement, before agriculture, before pottery, before metal, before significant, before language in a certain sense, and primarily what you see are depictions of animals, and there is of course, a lot of discussion about what is the meaning of those animals. The evidence suggests that these are not animals that are being eaten. There's an enormous evidence of what is being eaten. This is a site for feasts. And we know what's being eaten. What's been eaten is not what's being represented. So it's not exactly it. And it is unclear if what is being represented is what is feared. One of the sort of conventional theories of the beginning of symbols to absorb what you fear through representation. But it is a kind of negotiation with what we would now think of as animal. And when I describe those images as animal images, of course I speak much too quickly, as if we all know what animal is versus non-animal. But it is interesting that you have a monumental structure with an utterly sophisticated ornamental and representational system that in narrative terms, returning to Anselm's point, in narrative terms precedes the technologies, the attitudes, the languages, and the representational systems that would make such a monument possible. That is to say, Göbekli Tepe is impossible. So when you say, for example, that you get around the impossibility of describing the present by using a form of science fiction, even if you were to describe in the most scrupulously scientific fact mode, you would be describing a phenomenon that can only be thought of as science fiction. Göbekli Tepe is much more easily explained by alien intervention than by human intervention, because precisely by definition, there are no humans that one can speak of in relationship to this object, but this object can be understood as an incubator of what will later be considered to be human through agriculture, through political formations, and so on. So I kind of wanted to ask Pelin to consider the possibility. Well, you may have the alien theory, of course, that relatively straightforward, that Göbekli Tepe is a kind of message in a bottle that came from outer space. Maybe when your guys were on the way out, there was this other bottle coming in. Or what is it that you personally make, because you're living and teaching in this area, of this archaeological site, an archaeological dig into what? Like what are you able to say about this place, which not by accident Anselm and Hito and others are, and we are obsessed with this particular place. So if you were to sort of just describe this thing, what would you say about it? Göbekli Tepe, I mean.
Of course, neither for me and for my student is not a kind of a typical archaeological space to go and visit and something from the past. The space doesn't look like something from the past. Yeah, it's okay. So this is why it's difficult to describe as an archaeological site for us. And of course, we look through the speculation of artifacts, how to speculate on the, in this case, as a designer, as an artist, as an architect, how we can visit, and it's not a large space, actually, it's a small space, but whenever we go there, there are not many material artifacts to see, but how we can understand and define as a timeless artifact, how we can take it as a speculative material. But there is another layer. This is that it is a dilemma because the surrounding of the space is full of war. Full of bombing, full of surveillance, and like 8 a.m. in the morning, and helicopters patrolling around our apartments every morning. There is a huge, large surveillance going on with very advanced radar system, and there's a very ambiguous war, kind of opaque war, they call it right now. This is the military security analysts are defining opaque war. And the surrounding is with its ongoing layered worshipping, bottling, and violence, and then you have the still space with those artifacts. And this is the confusing part. This is the confusing part as time, thinking of time,
yes.
Thinking of artifact, like demolishment of houses in Nusaybin, and thinking of this demolished, bombed house as an artifact of urban warfare, and then you go to turn your face and you see this timeless, futuristic something artifact, and the scale. I get in confusion of scale.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
just to
This was my problem of the.
Quick response, because I think I do think there's of course this incredible link between the three papers. The timelessness one could understand to be a kind of impossibility of placing within narrative, like it's an odd object. The central claim of this Biennale is that what it means to be human is to somehow embrace a sense of confusion in the face of an object. And this is a profoundly confusing object, a kind of narrative killer, if ever there was one. And I think your kind of response, well, what if it's just timeless, like that is to say endlessly weird, I think it fits. And this dream to escape Earth is the dream to go to a place that is not scarred, is not a battlefield, but as Lydia perfectly points out, all of those research projects were carried out with the understanding that the future battlefield would be outer space. So it was all about the possibility of defining outer space as a battlefield. This is a whole other question, whether what it means to be human is to treat other humans really badly. It's possible, right? But I have a feeling, sorry to be so quick, that we are supposed to move on to the next panel.
I just want to say, I was reading your text in the airplane yesterday when I was flying yesterday night from Mardin to here, And I wanted to ask a question about it's a beautiful text and things that I don't know so much. The voluntary slave that you define, and then this slave-mastery relation in the technological. I was thinking, does it creating a kind of a closure of determinism of such a relation between master and voluntary slavery, and how the potentialities of creation, creativity of technology lies there? I mean, it's a long question. Maybe we don't have time to discuss it. But this was a kind of little bit, when I was reading, kind of a, my text is also passive nihilist, Hollebeck style of nihilism, passive nihilism of Hollebeck. But this text was at the end with the master and slavery relation was also a little bit passive, determinist, nihilist approach. I mean, what would be the potentialities and creativity? How we can go beyond this slavery mastery relation? This is what I was thinking to when I was flying here. It's long, maybe to answer, but
well, I can't wait to read yours. And I I was interested when I was writing this text in something in reference to closure. These experiments were done in a vacuum, but they were reflecting much larger issues. And I was thinking of how we operate today in our contemporary world, where we have like everything, we have a giant cloud of so much information that I believe is described by the curators as a galaxies of devices, of this and that. Everything is available to us constantly. And the idea of ubiquity, pervasiveness, interconnection of everything, what kind of subject that is creating. And I was thinking that perhaps one idea, one possibility is that it's creating a subject that does not need to be embedded in the world so much, but absorbs the world and creates a kind of self-referential entity around it. And the master-slave is part of this kind of bubble, or the reconstruction of this type of closure. The fact that you have a reality that is closed and self-contained, a reality where our idea of embeddedness in the world, because of this ubiquity, might be rendered obsolete. So I didn't get a chance to write that as a conclusion, possibly because I don't like conclusions, possibly because I didn't think of it at that point. But in the back of my mind is this idea that that it's a precedent for a much more nuanced condition now.
Which is an excellent conclusion to this panel.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll invite Francesca up to kick off the third panel. Do you want to handle the slides yourself, or do you want me to?
I might next you, if that's okay.
That's totally all right.
I'm going to jump straight in. It's a very great pleasure to be here. And given that I had been working on error for the last few years, I really welcomed the possibility to think about correction, because correction's obviously been stalking me whilst I was working on error. So next, please, Nick. If to err is human, to design corrective systems is even more so. It has to be. When in 1962, Ethan Sutherland designed the first drafting program that would allow us, amongst other things, to draw better circles, he was in many ways simply providing an update on Alberti's circle drawing system issued some 500 years before in De Pictura. We all know it very well. Crucially, in both of these systems, you don't actually have to be able to draw a circle to draw a circle. Next, Sutherland radically augmented the corrective capacity of the algorithm at work in an exercise that's not difficult for machines, but is exceptionally tricky for humans. Whereas Alberti devised a kind of approximating scaffold that would be a series of stepping stones, make it into a join the dots exercise, Sutherland did away with the stepping stones altogether. So there you see The dashed line is the line of the pen. You can do a wobbly circle and a perfect circle comes out. Next, Sketchpad, the software Sutherland wrote, set up almost everything required for the computing interface through which so much design is now thought, developed, and represented, including ambitious new strategies for correction. Sutherland's radical solution was to correct the error before it's even made by simply never letting it appear on the screen. So to delete the wobble of the hand-drawn circumference by simply never registering it on the screen. Whereas Alberti's stepping stone dots had kind of gently corrected our erratic radius, Sketchpad effectively ignores it, and uses the light pen's location only to decide how much arc we do, i.e. it ignores our wobbly radius or our changing radius, which is to say, post-Sutherland, now you really don't have to be able to draw a circle to draw a circle. Sketchpad's design incorporated other strategies for opportunistic correction in the form of prediction with latching. And Sutherland kind of says, he talks about the software computing a moment, saying, gee, I think that guy actually is close to the line. I think he actually really wants to be exactly on the line, so I'm just going to put him exactly on the line. So that is, the software corrects us through the assumptions of approximation. Next. This relieves us of input exactitude, which is not to say the Sketchpad product is in any sense a sketch. On the contrary, the corrective nature of what is essentially the beginning of predictive programming, this is what Sutherland was devising, allows you, as he says, to be quite sloppy as you draw, but still get a precision drawing out at the same time. As to make a model in Sketchpad is effectively to make a model of the design process itself, to correct this drawing is by default to correct the design process itself. A process whose legacy is now such that it no longer actually needs a designer anymore in the sense that Disegno once imparted. This algorithm, Sutherland's algorithm, is the end of doubt. This is Sutherland's coup de grace, as it were, predictive programming as preemptive correction. Next, please. Our most exquisite, then, and ancient self-correcting tool has always been not the pen nor the scalpel, but the algorithm. Latent in the prehistory of the algorithms that now almost every aspect of the designed environment is quite simply a facility for correction. The verb to err, let's say, to drift from a true course, reminds us that the task of any corrective system is primarily circulatory. It's primarily architectural. It's primarily a set of corridors that irrigate the data, keeping it on the true path without fear of any kind of deviation. Next, we can find this corrective architecture's nascent circulatory logics in the storage and retrieval pathways of various mnemonic architectures from Cicero through to Flood, Camillo here, so on. Next, we can find its exhaustive but never exhausted recursive organization in the kind of looping recursiveness, let's say, of the winged seraphs, another mnemonic model from Ars Memoria. Next, we can find its ambitions for omniscience through radical reduction, one system that could hold everything and therefore computate everything in the wheel. Look, the footprint of the machine is there, so this is Bruno's wheel, but Lull had wheels as well. And then next, obviously, as the machine and language finally meet via the binary, we see it again. This is Leibniz resurrecting the binary. So next, today, algorithms with their predictive disposition effectively correct not only how we park our cars, how much of the day we stay seated, but also how we spell our best friends' names, which is particularly irritating, or who we fall in love with, and sometimes even why. Like the mnemonic architectures of antiquity that reserved a seat for everything except forgetting itself, these algorithms similarly allow every output decision except indecision itself. In an effort to disarm our innate hostility, and certainly my innate hostility towards algorithms, Pedro Domingo describes them to us as curious children that just want to observe us, imitate, and experiment. But in the evangelical and kind of paranoid narratives that surround the search for the master algorithm, what is often left out is that these very badly brought up children, while eating up all the data that we can feed them, can't resist the impulse to correct us. They're also shockingly simple, both in their makeup. Their architectures speak of a kind of nihilistic reduction, as does the promise of the master algorithm to be, that is, the last thing we will ever need to design, invent or solve, as it will do the rest for us forever. Next, please. What these narratives don't tell us, and why don't they tell us this, I'm not sure, is that the algorithm and the genealogy of machines of thought it belongs to has already been correcting us for a very long time. Lull housed his Ars Combinatoria in a set of paper wheels, anticipating, obviously, Leibniz's wheels. Leibniz gave them then the cogs that counted their way up to Babbage. In the perennial search for an algorithm that would finally and fully correct us, we've endeavored to equal and failing that mimic the machine long before it even existed. That is, the machine of thought is our most continuous and most cunning mirror. Consider the current Holy Grail, the quest, and it's always a quest for some reason, it's never a simple search, for universal learning simply is a digital reformulation of the Enlightenment project of universal language. The universal method was to, in providing an omniscient system, solve all disputes by calculating the truth and therefore act as a bridge joining what had been God and was still God to what will, no doubt, be the master algorithm as soon as we design it. Consider next, as Paolo Rossi did in the same year that Sutherland devised Sketchpad, nearly done, Leibniz facing not the dawn of modernity, but actually the twilight of the Renaissance, which is to say, Leibniz in his work folded in so much of the paranoia of the Kabbalah and the Magi and so on. Just as the algorithms that power the data economy are now fed with a staple diet of all our buy-with-one-click decisions and therefore have encoded all of our fears and prejudices in their very makeup, the universal method itself was contaminated with this paranoia. But these languages were also learning machines. They also barely concealed their corrective impulse, usually masters efficiency, which will short-circuit ambiguity and the equivocation of the natural language, to make amends for its pride lost at Babel, as Boyle put it. The corrective project is always a punishment for our wobbly circles, our ill-parked cars, our sedentary days, and our impulsive choice of lovers. But next, please. Last two slides. The most important obstacle for machine learning now, this will be interesting for Eyal, is the problem of overfitting, hallucinating patterns that aren't really there. And actually Diderot cautioned us against exactly this. Last slide. What if we were to consider then artificial intelligence to be the most human product of our imagination, and that it's always been driven by our fear of imagination itself? The slipperiness of the words we weave, of their artful dodging of logic, and of our ability to not only hallucinate, but to doubt, defer decision, and to err. Our fear of artificial intelligence can only be our fear of ourselves. We are all of our fears and all of their products. We are those badly brought up children. Thank you.
No slides. So I'm going to say something that sort of lands between the e-flux piece called No You're Not and the installation that's here or will soon be here in the bathroom. But Beatriz and Mark have long been special interlocutors who make one want to try harder to redesign oneself or discipline or institution or species or planet. So I was emboldened in this installation to try something different than what you would ordinarily hear from me. But I keep hoping that the global infrastructure space I study might contribute something, not just because it's 3D printing a new layer of the Earth's crust, but because designing within it might begin with redesigning some common habits of mind in Homo sapiens, Humans are beautiful, soft masses of flesh and iterative trial and error processes that are filled with information. And in some kind of fatal error, we accidentally assign a command center some idea of mind that's relatively information poor. A mind that lines up neurons according to litigious logical proofs or religious beliefs that make us want to be right, to be the one, or the one associated with the one and only. And it's so often a mind that's organized like a closed loop, a loop that likes to circulate compatible information, a loop that lashes out with a binary fight when it's challenged. And since the world's big bullies and violent dispositions thrive on this oscillation between closed loop and binary, it's as if we have nothing to counter them. We have only more ways of fighting and being right and providing the rancor that nourishes their violence. That so often seems to be the story of our humanities as we hammer things into each other's heads. So how do you drop through a trap door and contact a habit of mind on the flip side? How do you organize the body to enjoy all its powers? Powers that sometimes a logical mind treats like a kind of a cult. We're good at pointing to things and calling their names and making declarations, and not so good at seeing or manipulating the chemistry between things or the repertoires they enact. So maybe things, I hope maybe things like matrix space are productively imponderable, since they're too big and too complex to be a thing, a regular thing with a name. And to assess it and manipulate it, it's almost as if one has to cultivate one's canine powers to perceive in a split screen. You see things with names, just as you hear your human speaking words, but it's hard to separate or even really comprehend those words or resolve those things in the absence of 1,000 other cues and potentials and relative positions between things in context. The position of the human relative to the door and the dog bow and their posture or their potential for violence. It's all being assessed equally with the sound of words that are supposed to have assigned meanings. And that canine split screen can decouple actions and temperaments from declarations and right answers. So if we're designing with this other habit of mind, this kind of canine habit of mind, we're designing not right answers and master plans, but reagents and mixtures and interdependencies and chemistries and chain reactions or ratchets, time-release designs that are indeterminate to be practical. It would be like being good at playing pool, where knowing about one fixed sequence won't do any good, but being able to see branching networks of possibilities allows you to play longer or add more information to the table. Or maybe, whether it's an intimate space or a global matrix space, you're better at seeing the violence that doesn't declare itself like as war, but is instead imminent in arrangements and organizations. Or maybe you're better at changing the countless things within the medium. Without having to confront the bully, you can redesign something in the air or shape those moments of political metastasis and remission, like that moment when Welch said to McCarthy, "Have you no decency at long last, sir?" Or the moment when Tony Curtis said, "I am Spartacus." But anyway, in this more than human state, you would have to be too smart to be right. Thank you.
Yeah, it's the one that says PPT. PPT?
Kurgan, SUPERHUMANITY, PPT. No.
So, this will work. This just goes. How does this goes? 4. very hard act to follow. Just with because I was trying to decide between two different talks, and the one was more incomplete and had to do with the exhibit downstairs, which is often 1 to 8,000, which means that it's 8,000 times bigger than real life at some points. And there's another exhibit in the Archaeology Museum, which is 1 to 1,000, which means everything in the gallery, everything at the site is 1,000 times bigger than it is displayed in the gallery. So, and I'm going to do Aleppo because I think it's really important to end the day, to end this day with Aleppo, because nobody has really said that much about it, except for Beatriz this morning. So okay, the two exhibitions. But this over here is a photograph from Aleppo published by BBC News website on September 1st, 2016. The BBC sourced it to the Aleppo Media Center, a group of anti-government activists who have been prominent in distributing imagery from Aleppo on social media channels, posting photos on Facebook, as well as videos on YouTube throughout the war. They are one of a small number of networks of trusted on-the-ground sources for international news outlets, which for the most part are denied entry into Syria or have deemed it too dangerous to go during the civil war. You're familiar with their images, even if you don't know their name. A picture of a dazed 5-year-old Amran Dagnish sitting in an ambulance after surviving yet another airstrike from the Aleppo Media Channel as well. The photograph above from the neighborhood of Sheikh Said in the southeastern part of the city was taken just as the UN called for a 48-hour humanitarian pause to allow the safe delivery of food and medicine to the rebel-held East and government-controlled West. Today, actually, there's another 8-hour ceasefire, which is actually about to stop a few minutes from now. The BBC headline read, "Syrian boys swim in crater as battle for Aleppo rages." The AMC caption is a little different and makes a stronger claim. Whatever Assad has done in Aleppo, life is not over. Its children make a new life in every site destroyed by his rockets. On September 27th, Reuters obtained and circulated this video taken by a drone flying over the eastern side of the city. The rain-filled bomb craters are now eerily empty, and like in many other parts of East Aleppo, and new ones are joining them every day. When the drone footage appeared, it did not come with much context. Drone footage obtained by Reuters shows extensive damage in eastern Aleppo, was the headline. To find out what neighborhood was being photographed and how or why Reuters managed to fly a drone over it, we searched Twitter and YouTube and looked for a few things that might tell us or even show us about the site from the ground. Indeed, we found this image under the hashtag @HolocaustAleppo, which has been prevalent since the siege in July, posted by the Aleppo Media Center on September 4th, a day before the drone footage was released. We messaged and asked where this and which neighborhood this photo was taken. The reply from Tariq al-Abab, or al-Hiwaniye, a neighborhood in East Aleppo. A map can show you the neighborhood where that drone was flying at a different moment in time. Sorry, this is the siege. Yeah. At a different moment in time, as well as collect and spatialize. This is what it looked like. The YouTube video that is that's collected. So this is a spatialized map of a lot of YouTube video that's been released from Aleppo right now. So comparisons are now being drawn between sieges, Aleppo and Sarajevo, for example, between cities destroyed by war. The New York Times, Michael Kimmerman, and this is why I have to give this little speech that I'm writing, juxtaposes Berlin 1945, Grozny 2000, and Aleppo 2016, and comments on the drone footage used by AMC on October 2016. In it, we see, and this is, in it we see another destroyed neighborhood, El Ansari Mashhad in East Aleppo. He writes, "The destruction is so complete that it obliterates even a sense of time. For Aleppo and its diverse timescales, this is true on so many levels, historical and cultural, 5,000 years or 50 years old. A neighborhood is more than an assortment of buildings and streets." This is quoting Kimmelman. "It is life, shared and rooted in place, passed down through generations," unquote. And he takes the risk of generalizing across a series of comparable images. At a glance, I'm quoting again, "The video shot is from a drone, could show Berlin in 1945, Grozny in 2000. Mass death erases all distinctions," unquote. But the formal comparison between the images leads him to miss the most extraordinary dimension of the most recent one. For him, it seems the aerial image, communications from a distance, separation, the loss of lived reality of the street, and I quote, "Figures move through the pulverized rubble are hard to make out," Kimmelman continues. "Would you really feel any pity if one of the dots stopped moving forever?" Harry Leem asks on Ferris wheel in The Third Man, I quote, "The classic noir film set in post-war Vienna, this is drone footage after all, shot from the same detached superior perspective of the bombers who committed this atrocity in the name of fighting non-jihadist rebels. This video was made to document the devastation and bear witness, but it inevitably reduces people on the streets to Lime's dots," unquote. But this is not the view of a detached drone. Can I play it again? Yeah. Not all drone views are alike, nor do they all come from the detached superior perspective of the bombardier. As the caption at the very end of this informs us, the article in the New York Times, the video was taken by the Aleppo Media Center, a group of anti-government activists and citizen journalists who work to document the conflict through video, photography, and social media, unquote. In fact, the photographer who took the video is named Hassan Katan of the Aleppo Media Center, and he's one of the talented, committed, and decidedly undetached AMC activists who make it possible to see what's happening in Aleppo in order to stop it. So who is detached? The so-called international community which fuels the war, sustains Assad and ISIS, and sacrifices those in between and cannot even manage to get humanitarian aid to the besieged Aleppo? Hassan Katan is involved, not detached. It is up to us to look for the dots and do the hard work of making them out and imagining their lives. We owe that to him and his images. The views emanating from Aleppo during this siege and over the last 5 years of the war are complex, from the ground, from the air, in Twitter, on YouTube, in the hope of reaching an international audience. The video, like the map, is there for us to see. Let's read it carefully, ask what it shows, and act to change this catastrophic reality. Thank you.
So do you have any questions to ask each other?
No. I can maybe kind of pick up on a word that Francesca used, indecision. And I think that this question of being forced to make a decision or to have your decision already made for you is something that resonates within these closed loops that Keller was talking about, but also this this impulse, this debatably human impulse to have a decision made, to have some sort of resolution made to a situation in Aleppo. For some reason, and I hope that this isn't kind of too distant from each of these, but the figure of Bartleby could not have helped but come to my mind in this. And when hearing your three presentations, and at the same time I couldn't, I was thinking of Laugier, the way that he started his narrative of, let us consider man in his natural state. What does he want? He wants to lay down in the grass. And so I wonder kind of how we can, how on the one hand we can look at, this kind of hyper-productivity of labor today, and at the let's say the seeming impossibility of acting, this distance that you're talking about.
The non-distance, yeah. Well, actually, Francesca, I just loved your idea of error and thinking that you had to talk about correction, because everything that followed was really about more possible errors, which all the predictive algorithms fall prey to. So there's just this really great book that's just been written called, I think it's called Weapons of Math Instruction. Yeah, and it's all about the algorithms that govern our lives, and make our kids into little test-taking machines, and all of those kinds of things. And so the desire to think that you can correct for these errors, I think I think as Keller so brilliantly demonstrates, they're built in. They're embedded. They're embedded in all of the infrastructures that we attempt to use when we're trying to make resolutions, like using drones, to show the overhead view, because the world has to see the overhead view to understand what's going on in Aleppo. The Russians aren't showing it to us, nobody's showing it to us. And satellite images are very expensive. You can't buy them quickly enough to see.
Yeah, the image of Bartleby is sort of interesting. There's that kind of the violence of needing to remain intact, the violence of these global bullies. They're just smashing things to rubble, and no one has any, and the rest of the world is completely unable to do anything about it. Or the way in which you describe, Francesca, that impulse to algorithm when the error has so much more information, if there was a kind of artistic comfort with error and dynamic marker, what would be possible?
I must admit, to see Aleppo has slightly taken the wind out of my my anti-correction tirade, because this is a different order of things, isn't it? And that I completely loved Keller's piece when I read it. It was one of the first to come out, I think, one of the early ones. And Keller, when you talk about being too smart to be right, I felt like it was kind of it was formulating what I was trying to get at, is that the algorithms don't allow us to be too smart to not decide, too smart to hold on to our state of indecision, our state of doubt. And Aleppo reduces us to global doubt, and it feels like we're all held in this state of indecision, because how on earth does one intervene? What are the consequences that intervene? Our fingers are all so badly burnt by Blair's decisiveness and Bush's decisiveness and so on. But it's obviously a kind of clear example that, how long are we going to kind of luxuriate in our indecision, and what possible algorithm could advise us now? It's really kind of flipping. It sabotaged my talk perfectly. No. This is obviously considerably more important.
But this decision thing, it seems to me, there is this expression to make a decision. So a decision is made. Or at least there's an interesting question of the relationship between design and decision. And I have an affection for the view that says that decision is what you make when the evidence wouldn't indicate what you should make. In other words, decision is precisely a leap. You have to decide because the evidence doesn't decide for you. So in that sense, I think you're so right, or it seems so right, to look at the kind of end game of the logarithm in terms of, does one end up indecisive or decisive? And if I understand Keller correctly, and I would hate it that one day that I would understand you correctly, without error, that is, it's a kind of a call for a kind of canine designer, or a kind of canine, I kind of imagine a kind of sniffing around and a kind of lifting up of things and a kind of burying of a bone for no particular reason other than the extreme importance of burying a bone. And is it right to hear it as a kind of a call for an alternative? It's an alternative to design. I mean, because design the very word design seems to imply decision, which has a romantic side, like what you do when the evidence would not tell you what to do, but doesn't have the canine sort of stealthy, sniffy, sort of, sense that you evoke, right? So are you?
I guess it's in the spaces that I look at. Reasonable thought is always outwitted by unreasonable politics with, slightly orange tint, and or by incredible brutality that will until its dying breath bite and dominate. So it seems like having a reasonable idea just doesn't make any. It's not a good tool. Right. So trying to find another artistic comfort with with understanding the ways that lies work and stories work, and seeing a kind of more resilient. A more resilient way in which the world kind of devours and scrambles information would be maybe more useful. Knowing it's not exactly being indecisive, but not knowing the right answer. Just knowing it's sort of like what the difference between knowing that and knowing how, like that you maybe don't know the right answer, but you know what to do next, three paces forward, or in a more improvisational performance.
Well, the other talk that I didn't give might have responded to to Keller's canine. I don't know what you call it. Territory, architecture. Embeddedness, sensing, yeah. There are these games downstairs that haven't been installed yet, and with the neuroscientists, and it's their games. We've just redesigned them a little bit. It's the games that they use in their experiments, and when they talk about them, they don't ever think about having an answer to human imagination. Human imagination, or the mind and how the mind works. That's not at the forefront of their science. They're just trying to find out how can we, figure out Alzheimer's, or how can we, and these are important things. They're diseases and they're functions of the brain, but it's reduced down to this blunt, simple language, even though we think that they're the most complex computing machines and algorithms and things in the world. Science itself reduces the brain to functions which need to be resolved, right? And so, yeah, that's something I'm going to write about for e-flux. So.
Just a last, for pleasure, if that's allowable. Ever.
Totally, yeah.
I mean, preemptive correction, of course, reminds me of Ronald Reagan, kind of preemptive retaliation. It is so. I love this weapon of mass instruction. The preemptive correction as a kind of, let's say, as a way to understand pretty much all channels, and even maybe the idea of a channel that one could sort of delegate sort of decision-making capacity and information capacity to different channels. If one sort of just puts your beautiful paper on steroids, which would be less beautiful, sort of Schwarzenegger version, preemptive correction would become, let's say, the dominant mode of social interaction, and it would be therefore not a feature of contemporary computational technologies, rather the other way around. Contemporary computational technologies would be attempting to master the fine art of preemptive correction. And in that sense, it seems to me, if one was then to sort of research this mega theory, architecture would be a decent candidate. That is to say, architecture is not about housing people who have specific needs and so on. It's a kind of preemptive correction. In other words, it puts in place a kind of certain set of constraints with the understanding that the inhabitants are likely to need correction. And I think if you reread kind of classical architectural theory, it really does somewhat too easily fall into the line of instruction through objects, like instructional objects that take that kind of form, and not by accident. Those early books were also very much aligned with economic, political, military organization, and the people who wrote those books were also participants in all of those kinds of realms. I mean, I apologize for the sort of scale of this position, but it seemed to me, if this Biennale was about preemptive correction, it'd be a seriously good Biennale, it seems to me. It's like a really big subject.
Except to, when it is true that all those experiments were linked to the military, right? But it's the same thing with the drones. It depends who's using them and what they're used for. So, sometimes funding structures, you can undo the intent of the funding structure by the work that you end up, by the ways in which your work gets disseminated, or the way it gets abused. And I think that they were unlikely military. Who know? Because the military also they do so many experimental things. They have so much money that some stuff I've never done at a DARPA grant, and I won't. But still, so much of that work just gets thrown away because.
I mean.
And especially those those experiments, yeah.
Yeah, so just a sort of a footnote. It seems, I mean,
curiosity.
To use the word military, not as a pejorative term, but as a term that describes actually first and foremost a certain experimental capacity, and that has been not just a recent history, but a kind of a dominant history. So I mean. I'm kind of obliged to stop us from being the badly brought up kids and so on, because this building is going to close at 7. But I think it's really impossible for Beatriz and I and Nick and in acting for Anton and Nicholas to sort of thank you for your text and your contribution and your conversation. I hope it's kind of obvious to those of you who are still with us, remarkably, that these are amazing writers. These are really the sort of gifted voices, and this whole project was just a kind of a trick, kind of to organize a kind of a dinner party where the most amazingly group of people will attend, and it's just a real pleasure to listen. For those of you who don't know, the Superhumanity is alive and well and in the depot space, and you will find text there, and I think there is a new one going up tomorrow. You may even witness it being posted. That Beatriz and I will do another panel tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock at Beaumonti on the question of time. And if we could, with that panel, be as interesting as you, especially the three of you, we would be really, really lucky. And we welcome you all to Beaumonti tomorrow. But again, thanks, and thanks to Nick for doing a wonderful job. Yeah.